The buggy came up the road at first light, when the frost still lay white on the grass, and the cattle on the far ridge were nothing but dark shapes against a pale sky. She'd already spotted it half a mile out, turning off the main road toward the gate. By then she was standing at the fence line, coat buttoned to her throat, one hand resting on the top rail. The wood held steady under her palm. She'd replaced 3 of those posts herself back in October, working the post digger alone in half-frozen ground until her shoulders ached for a week straight. She watched the buggy come on. The man driving it sat up straight, the particular posture of men who have never had to wonder whether the world would make room for them. He'd written ahead, which she gave him credit for. She'd folded the letter into thirds, left it sitting on the kitchen table for 4 days before she answered. "You're welcome to come," she'd written. "I'll hear your offer," that was the whole of it. She hadn't asked anyone what they thought she should say. There wasn't anyone left to ask. Behind her, the west pasture lay pale and waiting, last year's cut stubble still standing in rows. Past that, the second well, the one she'd sunk with her own hands in year 3. 3 weeks of borrowed equipment, and one neighbor who'd shown up without being asked and hadn't left until it was finished. Water had come in at 41 feet. She still remembered the sound it made hitting the casing, the way it rose up the shaft like something that had finally made up its mind. The buggy slowed at the gate. She didn't move toward it. He climbed down carefully, the way men in good boots always climb down, minding the mud, and looked first at the fence line, then out over the west pasture, and finally at her. Whatever he saw in her face made him hesitate half a second before he found his smile. She had been in Larkspur Bend 4 years, 1 month, and 19 days. She'd arrived with a carpet bag, 1 trunk, $18 sewn into her hem, and a husband she'd never laid eyes on who was already dying by the time she stepped off the train. She'd left Zanesville, Ohio, in the September of 1881, riding a train that smelled of coal smoke and wet wool, watching the land go flat and then rise again into something she had no word for yet. She hadn't known then what she was walking into, hadn't known about the debt or the busted equipment or what was written into the deed. Hadn't known that the man who'd sent for her would do one quiet thing, without telling a soul, that would end up changing the whole shape of her life. She had known only that she was 28 years old, a widow once already, and that a letter from a stranger in Wyoming territory had offered her somewhere to land. The speculator opened the gate and came toward her with his hand out. She watched him cross the yard and let her mind go back to where it had started. The train pulled into Larkspur Bend at 2:30 on a Tuesday in October, and the platform wasn't empty. She'd known it wouldn't be. A small town finds reasons to be near the depot when something worth watching is due in, and a mail-order bride stepping off the westbound counted as something worth watching. She'd braced herself for it on the last stretch of the ride, sitting with her carpet bag in her lap, watching the valley open around her, wide, pale, cut through with the shadow of mountains that looked nothing like the hills back home. She stepped down and the cold found her first. October in that country wasn't autumn the way she understood autumn. The wind came down off the range flat and indifferent, moving through her coat like the coat wasn't even there. She counted maybe a dozen people on the platform. A man loading freight, 2 women loitering near the mercantile who plainly weren't there to buy anything. A boy perched on a hitching post, and near the far end, standing apart with his hat in both hands, a man well past 50, thinner than his letters had led her to picture. She'd read those letters enough times to know them by their creases. Careful handwriting, plain words. A ranch outside town, honest work he'd called it. He'd never once described his own face. She hadn't thought to mind that until right now. She picked up her bag and walked to him. He watched her come the way a man watches whether he hasn't decided yet whether to trust. Not unkind. Just careful. When she reached him, he was still holding his hat, turning it slow in his hands. He said her name like a man reading it off a page for the first time, unsure of its sound. She didn't correct him. "You look cold," she said instead. "Is it far to the place?" Something moved through his face, not relief exactly, something quieter than that. 4 miles, he said. "I've got the wagon." She nodded, and didn't glance back at the women by the mercantile, though she could feel them watching. Didn't look at the boy on the post either. She picked her bag back up and followed him down the platform steps, and the wind cut through her coat again, and she didn't break stride. The ride out took the better part of an hour. He spoke once to point out a ridge to the north that marked where his land started. She looked where he pointed and said nothing. The road was rutted, and the mule pulling them moved like a creature with no particular opinion about hurrying. She held her bag in her lap and watched the country widen out, the mountains far off to the west still wearing snow, and tried to get some sense of the size of what she'd agreed to. The homestead came into view at dusk. She hadn't known what she expected, something more finished, maybe. The house was standing, but only just. The porch sagged at one corner, where a support post had sunk into soft ground and been left uncorrected. The barn roof had been patched 3 times over with 3 different materials, none of them matching. The near-pasture fence held on the north side and gave up entirely along the south. She took all of it in without a word. He helped her down and went to see to the mule while she stood alone in the yard. On the inside sill of the front window sat a tin candle holder, dented on one side, a stub of tallow already burning against the coming dark. She could see it clear across the yard. She looked at it a long moment, then went inside. If you'd stepped off that train not knowing what waited at the other end of a 4-mile wagon ride, would you have gone anyway? Stay close, because what she found in that desk drawer 2 weeks later would decide everything that came after. 4 years on. She can walk the whole property blind and know every rise and hollow by feel alone. She doesn't need to look at the west pasture to know the wheat's coming in true. She can tell it from the particular heaviness that settles over that ground in the late evening. A stillness that means something is growing well. She knows which floorboards in the barn have gone soft and where to put her weight instead. She knows the exact hour the mule starts fretting when rain is 2 days off. She learned most of that in her first fortnight here, and what she mostly learned in that same fortnight was how bad things actually were. She found the ledger in the desk drawer, tucked beneath a folded survey map. The debt was written out in a plain, careful hand, $1,600 owed to the First Territorial Bank in Cheyenne, interest already climbing. She sat with that ledger open a long while. In the barn, the hay press lay tipped on its side, one arm sheared clean off where the metal had finally given out. The 6 head of cattle were thin-ribbed. The mule was serviceable, at least. There was enough hay in the loft to see them through winter, if she was careful with it. On the second morning, he came and stood in the barn doorway while she moved through it, taking stock, measuring with her eyes what couldn't yet be measured in numbers. He said her name again, closer this time to how it was actually said. "I should have told you more before you came out here." She didn't look up from the broken press. "Where do you keep your tools?" He told her, a wooden crate behind the press, half buried in loose straw. She dug them out herself. He showed her the well after that, and the failing stretch of fence on the north side where 3 posts had heaved clean out of frozen ground. He showed her the soft board in the kitchen floor that would give way come spring if nobody dealt with it. He moved through the place like a man finally working through a list he'd been putting off for years, and she followed. And neither one said aloud what both of them understood, that this wasn't an orientation. It was a man settling his accounts with a place he wasn't going to hold much longer. By the end of December, he wasn't rising before noon most days. She made a habit of finding somewhere else to be in the mornings, giving him whatever privacy his difficulty required. The cold helped with that. It gave her hands something to do, ice to break, stock to feed, fence posts to study even when she couldn't yet fix them. The work was real, and the work didn't ask her to decide anything yet about what she owed or what came next. He died on a Wednesday in January, nothing dramatic about it. No last conversation she'd spend years turning over, hunting for meaning in it. She'd been outside since before first light, working ice out of the stock trough with a blunt mallet, her breath coming in short white bursts. The cattle were restless that morning. The mule stood close against the barn wall, ears flat, indifferent to the cold the way animals get once they've made their peace with it. When she came back inside, he was already gone. She knew it before she'd crossed the room to him, some quality to the stillness that wasn't the same as sleep. She stood at the foot of the bed a moment, then went to the window. The tin candle holder still sat on the sill, dented side turned toward the glass. The wick had burned low, but it hadn't gone out. She left it exactly where it was. She stood there with the cold still riding off her coat, the wick burning, the cattle shifting somewhere out in the frost, and stayed until she felt ready to turn around and do what needed doing next. The lawyer kept his office in town. The deed sat locked in a strongbox in the desk, right under the ledger with the debt in it. She didn't know yet what the deed said. Wouldn't know until Friday, when the lawyer opened that box and read her the amendment inside it. Friday came in low and gray, no wind at all, the kind of morning that just sits on your shoulders. She wore her second-best dress, the charcoal one, better than the black but not by much, and walked the 2 miles into town with the cold working up through her boot soles. The mule had gone tenderfooted, and she didn't want to press him for it. The lawyer's office sat above the dry goods store, up a narrow stair that turned once at the landing. She'd never climbed those stairs before. She went slow, not from nerves so much as the cold still sitting heavy in her legs. He was a man well into his 60s, ink-stained at the fingers, with a way of arranging his face that she recognized on sight, the careful neutrality of someone bracing to deliver bad news to a person who can't afford to take it badly. A strongbox sat waiting on his desk. He opened it with a small brass key. She sat with her hands folded and waited. He read the deed first, then he looked up at her over the top of the page. The amendment, he told her, had been filed back in August, 2 months before she'd ever set foot off that train. Her husband had added her full name to the deed before she'd ever seen the ranch, or the mule, or those 6 thin cattle standing out in the frost. Before he'd even known, really, what kind of woman was about to step down onto that platform. She asked him to read that part again. He did. Then he set the page down and gave her the look he'd clearly been bracing to give her. The debt, $1,600, First Territorial Bank of Cheyenne, had passed to her along with the land. He said it carefully with a small pause before the number, the way people handle things they expect to hurt going down. She said nothing. He told her that given the state of the ranch and the size of what was owed, she might want to consider, and here he reached for a lawyer's phrase. Something about arranging a sale of the asset before the obligation became untenable. She let him finish the sentence, then she asked for a copy of the deed. He blinked at her, said he could have one drawn up by the following week. "I'll wait," she said. He looked at the strongbox, then at her, then got up and went to the copying press at the back of the office. She sat and looked out the window while he worked. The clouds hadn't changed any, flat, settled, the kind that don't mean snow, only cold that means to stay a while. He brought her the copy still faintly damp off the press. She folded it once lengthwise and tucked it into her carpet bag beneath the spool of gray thread and the bone-handled scissors. She thanked him, stood, went back down the narrow stairs into the cold. She walked home with the deed in her bag and the wind at her back and nothing else decided yet. 6 weeks into owning a ranch she never asked for, a debt she never signed for, and a name on a deed she didn't know was coming. Most people would have sold and gone home to Ohio. She didn't. What she did instead is the part worth staying for. January had taken him. February came in with mud that swallowed fence posts to the second rail. She stood at the edge of the west pasture and looked out over 40 acres of nothing, hard-packed, frost-heaved, untouched by anything grown on purpose in at least 2 seasons. Word reached her there was a wheat farmer working the valley floor 6 miles south, a man named Franklin Odom. She sent a note through the postmaster asking whether he had any interest in leasing ground. He rode out on a Tuesday, which told her something on its own. A man with plenty of other options doesn't come out on a Tuesday. He walked the field without much expression on his face, testing the soil with the toe of his boot. Said the drainage ran poor, said the eastern edge would need breaking twice before it was worth planting, said the whole arrangement carried a fair amount of risk on his end. She let him say all of it. He named a figure. She thought it landed close to insulting, and told him so without any particular heat in her voice. Said it the same flat way she'd have mentioned the mule needed shoeing. "That number doesn't account for the land," she said. He looked at her the way men had looked at her more than once already in her short time here, the look of someone recalculating. Then he named a second figure a little higher. She said nothing. Stood with her hands loose at her sides, and watched a hawk cut slow circles over the ridge while he talked himself in circles too, repeating the risk in slightly different words each time. 40 minutes is a long stretch to hold your tongue. He worked his way up to her original number all on his own, arriving there in small steps so he could tell himself later he'd landed on it himself. When he finally said the figure she'd been holding out for, she said, "Fine." Not yes, not deal, just fine, and put her hand out. His grip carried more surprise in it than she expected. The plow came out on the first warm morning of April. She heard it before she saw it, that particular sound of a blade turning ground, low and steady, like something being set right. She stood at the window with a cup of coffee going cold in her hand, and didn't go out to watch. Just stood there and watched the edge of the pasture from a distance, turned earth dark against pale winter grass, the slow, steady progress of the horse and the man walking behind it. She had a figure now, not a large one, but real, put down on paper and signed. She looked at the tin candle holder on the sill. The dent caught the morning light the way it always did, barely, but enough. She drank her coffee. There was still the debt hanging over her, but there was also this. The first winter alone was the one she hadn't planned for properly. She'd planned for the debt. She'd planned for the mule going lame, which it did that December, 3 weeks after the funeral. She'd planned, in the loose way you plan for things you can't see clearly yet, for being on her own out here. What she hadn't planned for was the north fence giving way in the first hard freeze. Posts rotted at the base where water had stood all through the fall. Wire gone slack, and then flat on the ground. 6 head of cattle standing at the gap, staring out at open country like a question she had no answer for yet. Getting the cattle back took most of a morning. The fence took longer. She had wire but no spare posts, and the ground had frozen past the point of easy digging, and she was driving each post in with a mallet a little too heavy for her hands, and doing it anyway. That's when she saw him coming across the field from the east. She didn't know him yet, just a man on horseback with a loaded wagon trailing behind, and she watched him approach the way you watch anything moving toward you on open land in winter. No expression on her face, waiting to find out what it was. He stopped a respectful distance off. Fence posts sat in the wagon bed, 6 of them rough cut, still carrying the smell of fresh-cut wood even in that cold. He said he had extra. That was the whole of it. Not I heard you had trouble, not I figured you might need these. Just that he had extra and she was welcome to them if she could use them. She said she could. He unloaded them himself. She didn't help, she was holding the wire, and besides, she hadn't yet decided whether to trust the offer. He set the posts down without any fuss, climbed back on the horse, and left the same way he'd come. She watched his back until the distance made him small. She used every one of those posts. The fence held clean through February. 4 years on now, she can pick out his roofline from up on the ridge. She doesn't go looking for it, that's what she'd tell you if anybody asked, which nobody has. She doesn't look for it, but she knows its angles anyway. The low pitch of the main roof, the steeper pitch of the addition he put up in year 2. The way the chimney catches the last of the afternoon light and holds on to it half a beat longer than everything around it. You come to know the shape of things you look at every day. That's not the same as meaning to. A stranger who shows up once with fence posts and no explanation, then rides off without waiting to be thanked. That kind of thing tends to matter more later than it does at the time. Hold on to that because it comes back around before the end. The cattle outfit sent a man named Emmett Prout out first in the spring of her 2nd year. Once the snow had thinned on the ridge, and the new grass was starting to show underneath. He sat his horse at the gate like a man who'd already made up his mind and had only ridden out to confirm it. She met him at the gate instead of the porch. He told her what he wanted: ridge pasture, June through September, right-of-way along the east fence for moving stock through. He named a number. She let it sit a moment, not from uncertainty, but because she'd already worked the figure out the night before, lying awake with the candle burned low. And she knew exactly what that grazing was worth in a dry summer when the outfits to the south would be pushing cattle north looking for feed. She knew it better than he did because she'd been walking that ridge since October and he hadn't set foot on it once. She named a different number, 30% higher. He looked at her like a man recalculating on the spot. She didn't fill the silence for him. He said the ground had sat idle for years. She said the grass hadn't. He said the access trail would need work done to it. She said she'd do the work herself and he could pay materials, all of it documented plain and fair. He looked out at the ridge. Looked at the 4 head already grazing her upper pasture, at the fence post standing new and straight along the east line. Said he'd have to take it back to the owner. "I'll be here," she said. He came back 4 days later with a quieter man she took to be the owner, a fellow who studied everything longer before speaking. He asked her 2 questions. She answered both without padding them out. He nodded once, the particular nod of a man who stopped arguing with what's plainly in front of him, and they shook on it at the gate. The rate she'd named the first time was the rate they settled on. She made her first debt payment that October. Drove the wagon herself, 40 miles into Cheyenne, and walked into the bank wearing the same dress she'd arrived in, a good dress, and still was. She set $400 on the counter in front of the teller. He counted it twice, looked up at her with an expression she didn't bother trying to read. She asked for a receipt. He fetched the bank officer, which hadn't been necessary at all, and the officer shook her hand in a way meant to come off congratulatory and landed somewhere closer to startled. She took her receipt, folded it into her coat, and drove back through the dark, rolling into the yard a little past midnight. The candle still burned on the sill where it always did. The mule stood patient in its stall. She put the wagon up and went to bed. Drought came in June of her 3rd year and never once let up. 6 weeks without rain, and the creek feeding the north pasture dropped down to a seam of mud and then quit pretending altogether. Her herd, grown now to 11 head, stood in the ridge's thin shade and didn't move through the worst of the afternoons. Odom's wheat down in the west pasture held on, barely, because his lease came with rights off the main irrigation ditch, and the ditch was still running, if just barely. Her own water was the real trouble. She'd worked the numbers 3 separate nights running by candlelight, tracing the underground water lines across the survey maps the lawyer had handed her. The same careful way she'd once traced the columns in that debt ledger, hunting for the figure that would change things. She knew roughly where water should be, 200 yards east of the barn, where the ground dipped just slightly, and the soil shifted color in a way that meant something to anyone paying close enough attention. She'd read about it in a territorial pamphlet, thought about it for a year and a half straight. She didn't have a drilling rig, didn't have money to hire one out either. On the 7th morning of the 6th week, she stepped outside to find a wagon sitting in her yard. It was him, the man from 2 miles east. A drilling rig loaded in the wagon bed, 2 hired men standing beside it, hats in hand, looking at the ground with the particular patience of men who have already been told what the job is. She stood in the doorway. He looked at her and said the ground looked right east of the barn and asked if she had a preference on where exactly to sink it. "East of the barn's where I'd have put it," she said. He nodded. His men started unloading. She went inside, made coffee, brought it back out, set it on the fence rail without a word. He took a cup without a word back. For 3 days straight, that was the whole arrangement between them. She worked, they worked. The drilling went slow, then slower. Then on the afternoon of the 3rd day, the sound changed, that particular sound of resistance turning into yield, and the water came up dark and cold and undeniably real. He washed his hands at the trough, told his men to load the rig. She'd spent 3 days composing something in her head, something measured, something that came close to proportionate to what he'd just done for her. And by the time she looked up, he was already climbing onto the wagon, and then he was gone. The water rose to 4 feet by morning, steady by noon. That well carried them through the whole winter, and by spring it was supplying the house, the barn, and a new trough line she'd extended east along the fence herself, paying a man from town in cash from the grazing money to help lay the pipe. That was how she'd come to measure things by then, whether the money came in on time. Twice now a man who owed her nothing showed up when it mattered and left before she could even say thank you properly. That's not the kind of thing that stays a coincidence for long, but it takes her another full year to admit that. Even to herself. It was a Saturday in early October when she walked the whole ranch the way she hadn't walked it since that very first week, the full perimeter, no stopping to work anything. Just looking. She started at the west pasture at first light. Odom's wheat had been cut back in August, stubble standing pale and even across the whole 40 leased acres. He'd asked her back in June whether she wanted to renew for another term, and she'd said yes before he finished getting the question out. 3rd year running now. That field looked tended in a way the rest of the land hadn't looked when she first arrived. Ditches clear, fence line true, soil turned dark where he'd worked a late cover crop along the south edge. She followed the fence north and up onto the ridge where the cattle wintered. 11 head now, 3 of them calves dropped that spring. She stood and watched them a while in the early cold, the way they moved without any particular hurry, like the grass had simply asked them to. The second well stood capped and marked with a post she'd set herself. She stopped there and laid a hand flat on top of the casing. The metal held the cold clean, the way water always holds cold. 4 feet down steady, still doing exactly what water does, she came back through the barn. The hay press stood repaired in the corner, fixed the second year by a man she'd found listed in the back pages of the Cheyenne paper. A man who'd charged her $40 and never once made her explain why she was running the place alone. She'd laid a hand on the press when he finished and found nothing wrong with it. It had run the whole following season without a hitch. She went inside. The candle holder still sat on the windowsill where it had sat since the morning she first laid eyes on it, dented the same as ever. Tilted at that same slight angle where the sill had never quite sat level. She hadn't moved it in 4 years. She stood at that window a long while. Outside, the ridge held the last of the afternoon light, cattle moving along its slow, dark shapes against pale grass, like they'd simply always been there. He came the next morning. She heard the horse before she saw it, a good animal, clean-shod, the kind brushed daily by somebody who wasn't its owner. He tied off at the post and walked to the door with his hat held at his side, which she understood was deliberate. A man who'd done this before, more than once. He looked to be around 50, dressed too well for this stretch of Wyoming, a watch chain and good boots. Wearing the patient expression of a man who'd learned somewhere along the way that patience reads as kindness. He gave his name and the name of his company, said he'd come out from Cheyenne, said he hoped she'd spare him a few minutes. She said she would. They stood on the porch because she didn't invite him past it. He started with the land itself, talked about the valley, the rail line pushing west, freight routes going in north of town. He spoke like a man who knew what he was talking about, and she let him talk. He said what she'd built out here was remarkable, and she believed he meant that part honestly, in the particular way men mean a true thing right before they use it against you. He said a woman in her position, alone out here, no family in the territory, carrying a debt that had taken years to clear. She deserved the chance to start fresh somewhere easier. He said the word security twice, said comfort once. Then he said a number, $6,200. He let it sit. She let it sit right along with him, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. She thought about the west pasture, wheat coming up pale green in March and going gold by July. Thought about the grazing contract, the ledger in the kitchen drawer, the figures that had finally, after 4 years, started moving the right direction. Thought about the second well and the cold of its casing under her palm just yesterday morning. "I appreciate you coming out," she said. He smiled, ready for the next part of it. "It's a fair offer," she said. He nodded. She stepped down off the porch and started walking toward the gate, and after a beat he followed. Neither of them hurried. The morning sat clear and still, the ridge to the north catching the early light the way it always did, pale, unbothered. At the gate she turned and put her hand out. He shook it, less certain now than he'd been a minute ago. "Thank you for coming out," she said again. He started in about leaving the offer open, about giving her time, about reaching her through the post if she changed her mind, and she let him get through all of it. Then she unlatched the gate, held it while he passed through, and latched it again behind him. She stood at the fence line and didn't watch him go. The land settled quiet once his wagon sounds faded off down the road. She stood there with her hands loose at her sides and looked out over what 4 years had made of this place. The west pasture ran flat and wide toward the tree line, fallow now, but still carrying the memory of last summer's wheat in the color of the turned soil, that particular reddish-brown that only comes from ground that's been worked, rested, and worked again. The ridge to the north caught light differently now than it had in the beginning. She remembered thinking that first year that it stayed pale up there all day, cool and indifferent no matter the hour. She knew better now, knew it moved through the whole day, pale to amber to something close to copper by late afternoon, and that the cattle standing on it in the evening light threw a particular shape against the sky, one she'd come to recognize the same way she recognized the mule's step in the yard. The tin candle holder still sat on the windowsill behind her. She hadn't looked at it that morning. Didn't need to. She turned east along the fence line and started walking, not because she'd decided to, but because her feet knew the perimeter by now and carried her along it without asking. The way they did most mornings, when there was ground to look over, and nothing yet pressing enough to call her back inside. Frost lay thin along the base of each post, and it would burn off by mid-morning, same as always. She saw him before she heard him, 2 miles east, small against the open country, walking his own fence line in that same pale light. Heading the same direction she was, north along his own eastern boundary, running parallel to her path. Unhurried. He didn't look up, she didn't call out. They moved along together like that a while, each one on their own ground, each in their own quiet, the distance between them holding steady, the direction the same the whole way. She realized she'd been watching her own boots for the last 100 yards or so. She stopped, looked up and out, and let the whole shape of the land come into her at once. The west pasture, the ridge, the slope holding the second well, the barn roof just visible past the yard. The deed with her name on it sitting in the kitchen drawer beside the ledger. The figures that had finally, after everything, started moving in her favor. She didn't look like a woman who'd survived something. She picked up her pace along the fence line, turned her face into the morning air, and kept walking east, toward whatever came next. With 4 years of frozen ground and borrowed help and stubborn arithmetic standing solid behind her, and no plans at all to turn back. What would you have done, standing at that gate with $6,000 on the table and nobody left to tell you whether to take it? Let me know down in the comments. And if you're watching this from somewhere the frost hasn't hit yet this year, or somewhere it never does, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. If this one found you, stick around, subscribe for more, and I'll see you in the next story.